She boarded flight ALX 4A2 with nothing but calm confidence. Avery Sinclair, a black CEO whose quiet presence could command a boardroom, took her seat in 1A, ready for a night above the clouds. But minutes later, the air shifted. The purser's polite smile was just a mask, her words laced with something colder. A seat issue, she claimed. Passenger comfort, she said. But was it really about comfort, or something far more insidious? How does a routine first-class flight turn into a silent battle of wills at 35,000 feet? What happens when the wrong person is targeted? And that person has the power to rewrite the ending. And what would you do if your dignity was tested, or the world was watching? Yet no one was supposed to see tonight. You'll hear the story of a woman who refused to move, not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. A woman who turned a seat dispute into a catalyst for change, and a pilot's unexpected act of courage that made all the difference. If you believe some stories need to be told, hit like, share this video, and subscribe because you're about to board a flight you won't forget. Avery Sinclair moved through the jet bridge with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years in airports, yet never lost the quiet reverence for flight. Outside, New York's late evening sky hung in a haze of violet and gold, the city's lights twinkling in the distance. She stepped into the cabin of Aerolux Airways flight ALX 4A2 bound for London, and was greeted by the familiar subtle scent of polished leather and faint citrus from the freshly wiped surfaces. The first-class section glowed under soft overhead lighting, a serene contrast to the chaos of the terminal she had just left behind. Avery had chosen the late flight for a reason. It gave her a pocket of calm before the high-stakes meetings awaiting her in London. As the CEO of Meridian Technologies, she lived in a world of relentless deadlines and billion-dollar negotiations. But here, for a few quiet hours, she could prepare, think, and breathe. Her carry-on was sleek, understated, and she stowed it neatly overhead before sliding into seat 1A. The seat cradled her comfortably, an oasis of order in the ever-moving machinery of global travel. She powered up her tablet, the glow reflecting softly on her face. Rows of data and graphs danced across the screen projections for a merger that could reshape an entire sector. Her mind began to lock into the familiar rhythm of analysis. The faint hum of boarding passengers was a background score, one she barely noticed. Years of travel had taught her to block out the bustle and focus inward. But there was something in the air, something subtle, a shift so faint it was almost imagined. A pause in the footsteps passing her row, the sensation of eyes lingering a beat too long. She dismissed it at first, chalking it up to travel fatigue. After all, she'd been through dozens of flights without incident. Still, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that she knew this feeling. She had felt it in corporate boardrooms where her credentials were questioned before she even spoke. She had felt it at charity galas where her presence was a surprise. It was the weight of scrutiny, dressed in civility. The cabin crew moved methodically, guiding passengers to their seats. One of them, a woman in her mid-40s with immaculate posture and a tight chignon, stood at the far end of the aisle, scanning the boarding manifest. Her name tag caught the light: Clara Whitfield, purser, the highest-ranking member of the cabin crew. Clara's eyes swept the first-class cabin like a quiet tide. And when they landed on Avery, there was the faintest tightening at the corner of her mouth. Avery's gaze met hers, steady but neutral. Years in leadership had taught her the art of measured stillness. She returned to her tablet, deliberately breaking the gaze. Yet she felt the moment lodge itself somewhere deep inside. She'd learned not to ignore such moments. They were often the first drops before a storm. A man in a tailored navy suit passed her seat, glancing at her tablet with a mild curiosity. The boarding continued. Announcements murmured over the speakers. Luggage rolled. Coats rustled. But Avery noticed Clara lingering near the galley instead of continuing her checks. The purser was speaking quietly to a younger attendant, Lena Price. If Avery read the badge correctly, Lena's expression was uncertain, her eyes darting toward seat 1A before looking quickly away. Avery adjusted the cuff of her blazer, a small, grounding gesture. She told herself to focus. There was work to do, a presentation to refine. She tapped her stylus against the glass, underlining a figure on her chart, but her ears stayed tuned to the ambient sounds, registering shifts in tone and tempo. Across the aisle in 1C, a man settled into his seat with a camera bag at his feet. He had the easy, observant air of someone used to watching rather than being watched. His eyes flicked toward Avery, then toward the galley where Clara and Lena still spoke in low tones. He didn't linger, but Avery caught the brief spark of awareness there. Her thoughts wandered back to the numbers on her screen. She traced through the logistics of integrating two multinational teams, the staffing redundancies, the supply chain adjustments. Numbers were predictable. People were not. And in the back of her mind, she knew that any challenge she faced in a boardroom was amplified in spaces where unspoken hierarchies ran deep spaces like this. The boarding slowed as the final passengers trickled in. A family with sleepy children, a couple exchanging quiet jokes, a solitary traveler lost in their phone. Avery glanced at her watch, mentally calculating takeoff time. London was 5 hours ahead. She'd have just enough rest to hit the ground running if she could rest. Another glance down the aisle caught Clara's eyes again, this time with no pretense of scanning the manifest. The purser moved forward, her steps unhurried, her face composed. She paused 2 rows away, greeting another passenger with a practiced smile, then shifted toward Avery's row. Avery's fingers stilled on her tablet. She looked up, ready to offer a polite acknowledgement, but Clara's gaze was assessing. Her tone clipped when she finally spoke. "Good evening. May I see your boarding pass?" "Please." It was an unusual request this far into boarding, but Avery obliged without hesitation. She tapped the tablet dark, reached into the side pocket of her seat, and withdrew the neatly folded pass. She handed it over, her expression calm. Clara's eyes dropped to the pass, scanning it quickly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Without meeting Avery's gaze, she placed the boarding pass back into her hand. "Thank you. I'll be right back." No smile, no explanation. Just a pivot and a retreat toward the galley. Avery slid the pass back into the pocket, her mind already sifting through possibilities. Maybe it was a random check, maybe a seating update, or maybe her stomach tightened. It was something else. She didn't like assumptions, but she had learned to recognize patterns. She drew a breath, long and quiet, and returned to her tablet. Her fingers moved, but her attention was split now, one ear tuned to the cabin behind her. Somewhere in that ambient hum, she felt the current shift again. The voice in her mind whispered, "This might not be over." Avery had just begun re-immersing herself in the spreadsheet when Clara's footsteps returned. The purser's polished shoes made soft contact with the carpet, each step deliberate, carrying a kind of restrained authority. Avery sensed the approach before she looked up. Clara stopped beside seat 1A, her frame casting a faint shadow over Avery's tablet screen. Her hands were clasped at her waist, posture immaculate, but her expression had cooled from polite professionalism into something more rigid. "Ms. Sinclair," Clara began, her voice clipped and precise. I believe this seat has been reassigned. I will need you to gather your belongings so we can seat you elsewhere. For a heartbeat. Avery simply blinked at her, processing the words. The tone was not one of inquiry, but of command. Her stylus stilled against the tablet, and she set it carefully down on the console. She turned her full attention to Clara, eyes steady. That's not correct. My boarding pass shows 1A. Avery's voice was even, her diction crisp but calm. She reached once more into the seat pocket and produced the pass, extending it toward Clara. Clara's gaze flicked briefly at the proffered document, but made no move to take it. The faintest curl appeared at the corner of her mouth, gone as quickly as it came. I'll need you to step aside so we can confirm, she said, her hand making a subtle but unmistakable gesture toward the aisle. Avery did not move. She kept the boarding pass in her hand, a tangible reminder of her right to the seat she occupied. With a measured breath, she said, "This is my seat. I am not moving until you verify that." The air between them thickened. Conversations in nearby rows faltered as passengers began to sense something out of the ordinary. A man 2 seats behind shifted, his magazine lowering slightly. Across the aisle, the man in 1C, Miles Carter, angled his body subtly, attention fixed on the exchange. Clara's chin lifted a fraction. "Ms. Sinclair, you are being uncooperative," she said, her voice losing its earlier veneer. "I will ask you again to gather your belongings so we can seat the correct passenger." The correct passenger. The phrase landed with an almost physical weight. Avery's mind registered it not as a procedural term, but as a judgment. She knew that tone, had encountered it in contexts far removed from aircraft cabins, in conference rooms where she was the only black executive, in luxury hotels where her presence drew second glances. She had worked too hard to earn spaces like this to have her right to them questioned without cause. "I am the correct passenger for this seat," Avery replied, her tone still composed but carrying a thread of steel. "My boarding pass confirms it. If there is an issue, I suggest we resolve it without asking me to vacate a seat I paid for." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned slightly toward the aisle and made a small hand signal. From the galley. Lena Price emerged, guiding another woman forward. The newcomer had shoulder-length blonde hair, a cream-colored coat draped over one arm, and an expression caught between confusion and discomfort. "This is Samantha Lee," Clara announced, gesturing toward the woman. "Ms. Lee, this is seat 1A. If you will wait just a moment, we will have it ready for you." Samantha's eyes flicked from Clara to Avery and then down to the carpet. She clutched her boarding pass as if it might dissolve in her hand. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The awkwardness radiated from her like heat, her posture betraying that she wanted no part of this scene. Avery's gaze shifted to Samantha, her expression free of hostility. She knew Samantha was not the architect of this confrontation, but her arrival, orchestrated by Clara, was meant to cement the challenge to Avery's place here. It was an unspoken suggestion that Avery's presence in seat 1A was somehow illegitimate. Clara moved fractionally closer, lowering her voice but not enough to keep it from carrying to nearby rows. "Ms. Sinclair, please do not make this more difficult than it needs to be. If you would simply comply, we can sort this out without further disruption." The word comply rang in Avery's ears. Her pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. She placed the boarding pass on the console beside her and folded her hands in her lap. "I am not moving," she said. "You have the manifest. You can verify it. I will wait." Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowed just slightly. the first visible crack in her professional mask. She glanced at Lena, who shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between the two women. Then Clara looked back at Avery. "Very well," she said. Her tone clipped. Her gaze moved past Avery to Lena, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a silent message. Lena's posture stiffened, and Avery recognized the shift immediately. It was the signal for escalation, the kind that could mean physical removal. In that moment, Avery's mind churned. Part of her considered compliance, give up the seat, avoid the scene, save her energy for the meetings ahead. But another part of her, the part forged in years of being the only one in the room, refused. This wasn't just about a piece of leather and a little extra legroom. It was about legitimacy. It was about the quiet erasure that happened every time someone like her was told to step aside. She straightened in her seat, meeting Clara's gaze head-on. "I am not moving," she repeated. Her voice was quiet but unyielding. The cabin seemed to still around them. Samantha shifted her weight, clearly wishing herself anywhere else. Lena stood frozen, torn between orders and her own conscience. Passengers nearby watched with open curiosity now, their eyes moving from Avery to Clara and back. Miles in 1C adjusted something in his lap. Avery caught the faint gleam of a phone lens angled just enough to capture the scene. His expression was calm, but there was intent in his eyes. Clara exhaled through her nose, short and sharp. "Very well," she said again, but this time it carried a note of warning. She turned on her heel and strode toward the galley. Avery watched her go, the boarding pass still resting untouched beside her. She felt her heart beat once, twice, in her throat. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. Whatever was coming next, she knew the moment of decision had already passed. She had chosen her ground, and she would stand it. The hum of the boarding cabin had shifted into something heavier. The soft murmur of conversation, the rustle of coats, and the metallic clink of luggage handles seemed distant now, all muted beneath the awareness that something was happening at the front of first class. Avery could feel the energy around her tightening, like invisible threads pulling taut. Lena Price stood a few feet away, guiding Samantha Lee closer. Samantha's cream-colored coat still hung from her arm, but her shoulders had rounded in on themselves. It was the posture of someone who wanted to melt into the floor. She clutched her boarding pass like a fragile talisman, her eyes darting anywhere but toward Avery. Samantha's voice, when it finally came, was quiet. "I think there might be a mistake. I was told this is my seat." Avery turned her gaze to her. Her tone held no edge, only measured calm. "Your boarding pass says 1. Samantha glanced at it, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "Yes, it does. But I don't want to cause a problem." Avery's lips pressed together. She could see the conflict in Samantha's expression, the unspoken understanding that she was being inserted into something uncomfortable. It wasn't Samantha's doing, but she was being used as a prop to reinforce Clara's claim. Clara stood just behind Samantha, her presence towering over the exchange without needing to raise her voice. "We'll resolve this quickly," she said. But her words were more for the surrounding passengers than for Avery. "There is no need for drama." The irony of that statement almost made Avery laugh. No need for drama. Yet Clara had brought another passenger to stand directly over her, an implicit suggestion that Avery should yield to avoid embarrassment. Avery kept her expression neutral. "You can resolve it without moving me," Avery replied. "I have my boarding pass. You have the manifest. Verify it." Clara's jaw tightened. "This isn't the way we do things. Ms. Sinclair. Avery's brows lifted just slightly. Then perhaps the way you do things needs to change. A few passengers shifted in their seats. The man in 2A coughed into his hand. The woman in 3D glanced up from her phone and leaned forward to get a better view. Miles Carter, still in 1C, didn't move much, but his phone was angled just enough to capture the interaction. Avery noticed, and a part of her was grateful. Evidence had a way of cutting through the fog of denial later. Clara stepped closer, her shadow falling across Avery's knees. "Please, gather your belongings. We have to keep boarding on schedule." Avery kept her eyes on Clara's. "I will not move unless the manifest proves this seat isn't mine." Clara turned toward Lena with a sharp look. The younger attendant's spine stiffened, her eyes flitting to Avery's and then away. The unspoken command was clear. "Prepare to remove her." Lena's voice was tentative. "Maybe we should check with the captain before Clara cut her off." "That won't be necessary." Her words were crisp, but beneath them was a flicker of impatience, maybe even frustration. She placed a hand lightly on the headrest of Avery's seat, as if to claim it by proximity. Samantha shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes lifted toward Clara. "I really don't want to take someone's seat if it's theirs," she murmured. "Can't we just check?" The tension that crossed Clara's face was brief but telling. Samantha was supposed to be a silent participant in this tableau, not a voice adding friction. Clara smoothed her features quickly. "Ms. Lee, please wait here," she said, stepping away from both women and toward the galley. Avery exhaled slowly. She had maintained her composure, but she could feel the heat rising at the base of her neck. Every instinct told her this was more than a simple mix-up. There was an assumption in Clara's manner, a certainty that Avery's presence here was somehow anomalous, out of place. She had lived through that assumption before, dressed in different clothes, but always with the same undercurrent. Her mind flashed to a board meeting years ago, when a new investor had mistaken her for an assistant and asked her to fetch coffee, before realizing she was the one running the meeting. The sting of that moment, the pause in the room, the forced smile she had given, to smooth over the awkwardness, all of it came back now. Samantha stepped slightly closer, her voice dropping so only Avery could hear. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be part of this." Avery gave her a small nod. "I know. You're not the one making these decisions." Lena lingered nearby, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Her eyes found Avery's for a brief second, and in that moment Avery saw hesitation, even sympathy. But Lena was bound by orders. Orders came first, at least for now, from the galley. Clara's voice carried low but sharp, speaking to someone out of sight. Avery couldn't catch every word, but she heard enough. The phrases non-compliant passenger and situation at 1A floated through the air. The coded language was familiar. It was the kind of phrasing that could justify escalation without ever stating why the conflict had begun. Miles leaned slightly in his seat, keeping his phone steady. His expression was calm, but his eyes were alert, cataloging every detail. Clara returned, her composure back in place, though her eyes had cooled further. "We're going to settle this now," she said. Her gaze swept briefly over Samantha and Lena before fixing on Avery. "I'm going to have the captain verify the seating. Until then, please remain seated." It was a shift in tone, a reluctant concession. Avery inclined her head, the faintest acknowledgement. "Very well." Clara gave a short nod to Lena. The younger attendant disappeared toward the cockpit, her steps brisk. Clara remained where she was, arms folded lightly, the posture of someone unwilling to cede ground. The seconds stretched. The boarding announcements droned on. Passengers filed past in the other cabin sections, but in first class the air felt thick and still. Samantha stood awkwardly by the window seat across the aisle. Not sitting, not leaving, caught in a no-man's land between two versions of the truth. Avery glanced toward the front, catching a glimpse of movement beyond the open cockpit door. A tall figure in a crisp uniform stepped out, his stride measured and unhurried. Even before he reached the first-class aisle, Avery knew who he was. Captain Daniel Rourke carried the kind of presence that commanded attention without a single word. His eyes, a cool gray, moved over the cabin, taking in the scene with quiet calculation. He stopped beside Clara, and for the first time since this began, the purser's posture shifted ever so slightly. "Captain," Clara began, "we have a passenger issue." This seat appears to have been Rourke held up a hand, not unkindly, but with enough authority to still the words. "Let me see the boarding passes." The request was simple, but it cut through everything. Clara produced her tablet with the digital manifest. Avery reached for her boarding pass and placed it in the captain's hand. He examined Clara's screen first, scrolling deliberately, his brow furrowed slightly, then smoothed. He looked at Avery's pass, comparing the details with what he had just seen. The silence in the cabin deepened, every eye drawn to the quiet transaction. Finally, Rourke looked up. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge of finality in it. "Seat 1A belongs to Ms. Sinclair." The words landed like a gavel strike. Clara's lips pressed into a bloodless line. Samantha let out a breath she might have been holding for minutes. Miles's phone captured the moment, steady and unflinching. Avery met the captain's gaze and gave a small nod. He returned it with the barest flicker of respect before handing back her boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Sinclair." The captain's verdict should have been the end of it. In most cases, it would have been. But Avery saw at once that Clara Whitfield wasn't ready to let go. Even with Captain Rourke's words still hanging in the air, Clara's posture remained taut, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on Avery with something colder than simple professional irritation. It was the look of someone unwilling to concede, not just a seat, but a point of principle they had built their authority upon. "Thank you, Captain," Avery said, her tone calm and even. She placed the boarding pass back into the pocket beside her, then retrieved her tablet. It was a small, deliberate act resuming the work she had been doing before the interruption, signaling to everyone watching that she intended to reclaim her space without drama. Captain Rourke gave a final glance at both women, then stepped back toward the cockpit. The authority in his stride was unshaken, but Avery didn't miss the subtle flicker of his eyes toward Clara, a silent warning that he would be paying attention. Clara stood still for a few moments longer, her fingers tightening around the edge of her tablet. Then she turned sharply toward the galley, her shoes making muted thuds on the carpet. Samantha Lee hovered uncertainly, her boarding pass still in hand. She offered Avery a faint, almost apologetic smile, before following Clara toward the back of the cabin, clearly relieved to be out of the spotlight. Avery allowed herself a slow breath. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, but she didn't let her guard down entirely. She'd learned long ago that open victories in moments like this didn't always mean the battle was over. Often, they just shifted the battleground. Across the aisle, Miles Carter slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. He met Avery's gaze for the first time since speaking up, giving her a small nod. His expression was calm, but there was a spark there, recognition, maybe even respect. She returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement of his support. The cabin seemed to settle. The sounds of boarding returned bins opening and closing, passengers adjusting in their seats, attendants offering pre-departure drinks. But the peace didn't hold for long. From the galley, Avery caught the faint sound of voices. Clara's low and clipped, Lena Price's softer and more hesitant. The younger attendants' words were harder to make out, but the tone was enough to convey unease. Clara's voice had the precision of someone issuing orders. Then there was a pause, and Lena stepped back into the cabin. She approached Avery slowly, stopping just beside her seat.
"Miss Sinclair," she said quietly, "we're still trying to clear a seating discrepancy. The purser has asked that you step into the galley so we can resolve it away from the other passengers."
Avery looked at her for a long moment. The request was couched in politeness, but the subtext was clear. Removing her from the seat would erase the visible assertion of her right to be there. It would recast the narrative for everyone watching, turning her into the problem rather than the one wronged. "I appreciate your position, Lena," Avery replied gently, "but I am comfortable staying right here until it is resolved." Her voice was steady, unyielding. Lena hesitated. There was a flicker of conflict in her eyes, loyalty to her superior on one side, awareness of the injustice unfolding on the other. She gave a small nod and stepped back, retreating toward the galley without pressing the point. It wasn't 2 minutes before Clara reappeared. Her steps were brisk, her expression a mask of professional detachment, but her eyes were hard. She stopped at Avery's seat, leaning in just enough to make the moment private yet visible. "Ms. Sinclair, I am concerned about your level of cooperation. If you continue to refuse instructions from the cabin crew, we may have to escalate the matter for safety reasons." The words were chosen carefully, wrapped in the language of procedure. But Avery knew the tactic. Safety reasons could mean anything once the term was invoked. It was the catch-all that justified any removal, regardless of the actual threat level. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her breathing slow. "Clara, I am not refusing to cooperate. I am simply insisting that my assigned seat be honored. The captain has already confirmed it is mine." Clara's mouth tightened. For the briefest moment, Avery thought she saw a flash of frustration, maybe even resentment, before the purser's professional mask slid back into place. "Very well," Clara said, straightening, but her eyes moved past Avery to someone behind her. Avery sensed rather than saw Elena step forward again, this time with a stiffness in her posture that hadn't been there before. Her hands were clasped in front of her, but the tension in her fingers betrayed her discomfort. It was then Avery realized what was about to happen. Clara had given the signal a subtle cue to prepare for physical removal if she continued to resist. The air in the cabin seemed to contract, the space around her shrinking. Every sound, the click of a buckle, the shift of fabric, the low hum of the ventilation felt amplified against the drumbeat of her pulse. Her mind raced. Part of her wanted to yield, to avoid the humiliation of being touched, pulled, and paraded through the narrow aisle. But the thought of standing and walking away from the seat felt heavier than the risk of confrontation. This wasn't just her fight anymore. The passengers had seen enough to understand that something deeper was at play, whether they admitted it or not. She sat up straighter, planting her feet firmly on the carpet. Her hands rested lightly on her knees, a posture of calm rootedness. "I will not move," she said softly. Her voice was steady, but there was a finality to it. Behind her, the motion in the aisle stilled. Passengers leaned ever so slightly forward, their eyes tracking the quiet standoff. Samantha was nowhere in sight now, likely seated in another row, removed from the unfolding scene. Miles Carter's phone was back in his hand, the lens barely visible but angled with precision. Clara studied Avery for a long moment, as if weighing the optics of forcing the issue further. Then, without another word, she turned and strode toward the front of the cabin. Lena lingered for a heartbeat, her eyes meeting Avery's in a silent exchange, before she followed. Avery let out the smallest breath. She knew it wasn't over. Clara hadn't surrendered. She had simply retreated to strategize. The threat still hung in the air, invisible but palpable, like the charged silence before a summer storm. She reached for her tablet again, more to give her hands something to do than from any real hope of focusing on the numbers. Her eyes skimmed the screen without absorbing it. In her mind, she replayed the last few minutes, cataloging every expression, every word choice, every shift in tone. Each detail was another thread in the pattern she had seen so many times before. The announcement for final boarding echoed over the speakers, pulling her back to the present. Passengers in the last rows shuffled past the first-class cabin, oblivious to the tension that had gripped it moments earlier. Avery watched them with a strange detachment, aware that her own journey on this flight had already diverged from the path she'd planned. She adjusted her seatbelt. The metallic clicked loud in her ears. It was a small act, but it felt like staking a claim. She would remain in Wana. She would not be erased quietly. From the corner of her vision, she saw the cockpit door open again. Captain Rourke stepped out, scanning the cabin. His eyes found Avery, and for a brief moment, they locked. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. He had not stepped out of this situation. Avery inclined her head in the faintest of nods. Then she sat back, shoulders squared, ready for whatever came next. The cabin door clicked shut with finality. The last of the passengers had boarded, and the muted rumble of the jet bridge disconnecting vibrated faintly through the floor. The air was warmer now, the smell of recycled air beginning to replace the faint chill from the terminal. Avery sat with her back straight, hands folded lightly on her lap. She could feel the pressure of eyes on her the way people tried not to stare while still following every beat of the unfolding situation. Across the aisle, Miles Carter was no longer pretending to read or adjust his belongings. His gaze was steady, observant, the quiet watchfulness of someone who had already decided this moment mattered. Clara reappeared at the front of the cabin. Her expression was polished but brittle. She began checking overhead compartments, greeting passengers in a voice that was just a little too loud, a little too cheerful. It was the kind of tone that told Avery the woman was performing calmness rather than feeling it. Lena followed a few steps behind, her eyes darting between Clara and Avery as if measuring the distance between a spark and a fire. Avery turned her gaze out the window. The tarmac workers were finishing their tasks, moving like small pieces in a distant play. She let the motion ground her. She'd been here before, not in a seat on an airplane, but in this place emotionally, the place where principle ran headlong into power. From across the aisle, Miles' voice came low at first. "Ms. Sinclair." Avery looked over. His tone wasn't intrusive. It carried the weight of someone who understood the stakes without needing a full explanation. "I've been filming since the first exchange," he said. "If you want this documented, I'll keep going." Her eyes held his for a moment. She gave a small nod. "Thank you." Lena's voice interrupted from just behind Miles. "Sir, please keep your phone down during boarding." Miles didn't look away from Avery. "Boarding is complete," he said simply, his tone neutral but his meaning unmistakable. Clara's head turned at that, her eyes narrowing slightly. Mr. Carter, if you could comply with crew instructions, comply. There it was again. That word, used not to maintain order, but to establish hierarchy. Miles set his phone down on his knee, but didn't turn it off. His voice stayed calm. I'm happy to comply with legitimate instructions, but asking me not to document an incident involving a passenger's rights is not one of them. The quiet in the cabin deepened. A few passengers shifted in their seats. Someone in row 2 coughed awkwardly. The woman in 3D glanced between Clara and Miles with open curiosity. Clara's tone dropped half a degree. Colder now. Mr. Carter, this is not your concern. It is, actually, he replied. It's everyone's concern when someone's being told to give up a seat that's rightfully theirs, especially after the captain's already confirmed it's theirs. Avery kept her expression still, but inside, a small spark of gratitude flared. She wasn't alone in this anymore. Clara's gaze flicked to Avery. Ms. Sinclair. Are you comfortable with this man involving himself? Avery answered without hesitation. I'm comfortable with any passenger choosing to act within their rights. The purser's jaw worked for a moment before she shifted her stance. Very well, but I expect all passengers to follow safety protocols. Miles gave a faint smile, more acknowledgement than triumph. The intercom crackled to life. This is your captain speaking. We'll be pushing back shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and electronic devices are set to airplane mode. The timing was perfect. Clara had no choice but to step back, moving toward the front to prepare for takeoff. But Avery knew this wasn't over. It was only on pause. The plane began to roll. The vibration of the engines filled the cabin, masking small sounds, but not the weight of the silence between people. Miles adjusted in his seat, angling his body slightly toward Avery without leaning over the aisle. You get this a lot, he asked quietly. Avery looked at him for a moment before answering. Not as often as I used to, but often enough that I can recognize the signs before the first word is spoken. He nodded slowly. It's like there's a script. And they expect you to play your role, she said. They expect compliance, he replied. And when they don't get it, they escalate. Avery allowed a faint smile. Sounds like you've been here before. In different settings, he said. I make documentaries, civil rights, social movements, things people like to pretend don't happen anymore. A ripple of turbulence nudged the plane as it climbed. Avery's hand rested lightly on the armrest. Steady. You picked quite the flight for your next project, she said softly. He glanced toward the galley where Clara had disappeared. Looks like the project picked me. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and the cabin eased into the quiet rhythm of cruise. But Avery stayed alert. She'd been on enough flights to know that unresolved conflicts had a way of surfacing again when the attention of the rest of the passengers began to drift. Sure enough, not 20 minutes later, Clara emerged from the galley again. This time, her approach was slower, measured. She stopped first at row 2, speaking quietly with a passenger there, then moved toward Avery's row. She stopped beside 1A, leaning in just slightly. Ms. Sinclair, we've had a request from another passenger who feels uncomfortable with the attention this situation is creating. Avery met her gaze evenly. And I'd like to move you to a different seat to ensure everyone's comfort, Clara said, her tone smooth, but carrying an undercurrent of insistence. Everyone's comfort. The phrase might have sounded reasonable to an outsider, but Avery knew what it meant. It meant that someone, perhaps Clara herself, wanted her removed, not because of a seating error, but because her presence was inconvenient to someone's unspoken bias. "No, thank you," Avery replied calmly. "I am comfortable here." Clara's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You're leaving me with few options, Ms. Sinclair." Avery's reply was quiet but firm. "No, I'm leaving you with the option to respect the captain's confirmation." For a moment, Clara's expression flickered. It was subtle, but Avery caught it. The frustration of someone who had expected compliance and received resistance instead. "Very well," Clara said at last, straightening. She moved on. But Avery knew this was far from finished. The purser's need for control had been challenged twice now, once by the captain and once by Avery herself. A third challenge might come in a form far more disruptive. Miles glanced at her from across the aisle. "You just made the next round inevitable," he murmured. "I know," Avery said, "but some things are worth the turbulence." The engines hummed steadily beneath them. Outside, the clouds stretched in endless white, but inside, the atmosphere was anything but calm. For a while, the flight settled into an uneasy quiet. The faint hum of the engines and the soft chime of the seatbelt sign were the only sounds filling the air. The cabin crew moved through the aisles with the mechanical grace of routine, but their smiles were thinner now, their steps just a touch faster, as though they were moving through invisible friction. Avery watched the silver reflection of clouds passing beneath the wing. Her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, not in impatience, but to keep her thoughts from settling too heavily in one place. She had learned long ago that moments like this weren't simply about the here and now. They were about every time it had happened before, and every time it might happen again if no one pushed back. Across the aisle, Miles Carter was pretending to scroll through his phone, but Avery could tell he was alert, waiting. Every so often, his gaze would flick toward the galley at the front, as if he could sense the next move before it came. It came sooner than either of them expected. Clara Whitfield reappeared, moving with the precision of someone who had rehearsed their next action. Lena Price trailed behind her, her eyes downcast, as though she didn't want to witness what was about to unfold. Clara stopped just short of Avery's seat, her posture as controlled as ever, but her voice was clipped. "Ms. Sinclair, I'm afraid we have a developing situation that requires your immediate cooperation." Avery turned her head slowly, her tone calm. "What kind of situation?" "We have received a passenger complaint about disruptive behavior. For safety, I need to relocate you to another section of the aircraft." The words hung there, heavy and absurd. Disruptive behavior. It was the catchphrase Avery had been expecting. Not because it described reality, but because it gave Clara the authority to act without explaining the real motivation. "I have not been disruptive," Avery replied evenly. "I've been in my assigned seat since boarding." Clara's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to debate this with you. Ms. Sinclair, please gather your belongings and follow me to the back of the cabin." Miles' voice came before Avery could respond. "Excuse me, but that's not accurate. This passenger has been calm and compliant the entire time. I've been here since boarding. I can attest to that." Clara shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass. "Sir, I'm asking you to remain uninvolved in this matter." "Involved," Miles repeated, his voice level. "I'm a witness. That makes me involved whether you like it or not." Several passengers had turned in their seats now, curiosity sharpening into something else concern, maybe even indignation. The murmur of voices grew, quiet but insistent, a current of human reaction moving through the cabin. Avery stayed still, her posture composed. "Clara, the captain has already confirmed this is my seat. Any further attempt to remove me without cause is a violation of my rights as a passenger." Clara's voice cooled another degree. "I'm giving you a final opportunity to cooperate voluntarily. If you refuse, I will have to escalate." There it was. Escalate. Avery knew exactly what that meant. A call to the captain, a possible diversion, perhaps even a call for ground security if they chose to land. It was a blunt instrument disguised as procedure. Her thoughts moved quickly. She could yield, avoid the spectacle, and carry her frustration silently. Or she could hold her ground, knowing the risk of humiliation was real, but so was the possibility of setting a precedent for every passenger who would come after her. She took a slow breath. "I will not move," she said softly. For a fraction of a second, the cabin froze. Even the hum of the engines seemed quieter. Clara's eyes narrowed, a faint flush rising in her cheeks. "Very well," she said, and turned sharply toward the cockpit. Lena hesitated for half a heartbeat, her eyes meeting Avery's in a fleeting glance before she followed. Miles leaned toward Avery just enough for his voice to carry. "She's going for the captain again." Avery nodded slightly, then let her. The minutes that followed felt like hours. The cabin buzzed with the low murmur of passengers discussing the scene in hushed tones. Avery caught fragments, words like unfair, ridiculous, and unbelievable filtering through the air. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain Daniel Rourke stepped out, his stride calm but deliberate. His eyes swept the cabin, noting the cluster of attention centered on 1A. He stopped beside Avery, his presence filling the small space. "Ms. Sinclair, I understand there's an issue again," he said, his tone measured. Avery met his gaze. "Captain, there's no issue on my end. I've been seated here since boarding, as confirmed earlier." Rourke's eyes flicked toward Clara, who stood a step behind him. "Clara, is this the same matter we discussed earlier?" "Yes, Captain, but the situation has escalated." "Has it?" he asked, his voice mild but pointed. "Because from where I'm standing, the only thing that's changed is the repetition of the same request." Clara's lips pressed together. "Captain, I'm acting in the interest of cabin safety." Rourke's voice sharpened just slightly. "Safety concerns are valid when they are real. They are not a tool for resolving seating disputes after the manifest has been confirmed." The purser's cheeks flushed. "With respect, Captain, I'm responsible for this cabin, and I'm responsible for this aircraft," Rourke cut in. "That includes the treatment of every passenger on board." The exchange was quiet, but the weight of authority was unmistakable. Clara's eyes flickered, a calculation behind them. Rourke turned back to Avery. "You remain in 1A. If anyone approaches you again about moving, they will answer to me directly." Avery inclined her head. "Thank you, Captain." He gave a brief nod and returned to the cockpit, the door sealing shut behind him. Clara lingered for a moment longer, then turned on her heel and moved briskly toward the galley without another word. The cabin exhaled as though it had been holding its breath. Miles's mouth quirked into the faintest smile. "That's 2-0, he murmured. Avery allowed herself a small breath of relief, though she knew the game wasn't over. People like Clara didn't accept public losses easily. They found other ways to reassert control. And with hours left in the flight, there was plenty of time for her to try. She settled back in her seat, the hum of the engines wrapping around her like a low drumbeat. Outside, the sky stretched endless and bright, but inside the cabin, The tension remained a thread pulled taut, waiting for the next hand to tug. For a while, the cabin seemed calmer. The meal service began, trays and carts moving in a careful choreography down the narrow aisle. Avery accepted a glass of water and declined the rest, preferring to keep her mind clear. Miles ordered coffee, his tone casual, but his eyes never stopped tracking Clara's movements. Clara was quiet for the first half of the service, gliding from row to row with an almost mechanical precision. Her smile was as professional as ever, but there was something sharpened behind it, a deliberate calculation, as though she were already plotting her next move. Lena Price passed by with the bread basket, offering Avery a tentative smile. "Would you like some?" Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Avery shook her head gently. "No, thank you." But she appreciated the small kindness in the gesture. It was a reminder that not everyone on this crew had signed on for a fight. Clara's approach came mid-service, disguised as routine. She stopped at row 2, bending slightly to speak to the couple seated there. Avery couldn't hear the exact words, but she saw the way the woman's eyebrows lifted, the small shake of the man's head. Clara moved on to row 3, repeating the same hushed conversation, punctuated by quick glances toward Avery's seat. Miles noticed too. His jaw tightened. "She's seeding the idea that you're the problem," he murmured. Avery kept her eyes forward, not wanting to give Clara the satisfaction of knowing she'd rattled her. "I know," she said softly. "It's easier for her to get me moved if she makes it look like the whole cabin wants it." By the time Clara reached row 4, the shift in atmosphere was almost tangible. People were looking at Avery a little longer, their expressions harder to read. It wasn't open hostility, not yet, but the seed had been planted. When Clara reached the galley again, she stopped to speak with Lena. The younger attendant glanced toward Avery, nodded once, and then disappeared toward the economy section. Moments later, Samantha Lee, the woman who had been the intended replacement for Avery's seat, was led back into first class. Samantha's cheeks were pink, her posture a mix of embarrassment and discomfort. Samantha paused by Avery's seat. "I'm sorry about all this," she said quietly. "I didn't ask for the seat. They just told me to take it." Avery met her gaze and spoke gently. "I know. This isn't about you." Samantha gave a small nod and moved to an empty seat in row 2. But the damage was done. Her return made it clear to the watching passengers that Clara had tried and failed to seat her in 1A, reinforcing the idea that Avery was standing in the way of order. Miles shifted in his seat. "She's using optics now," he said, "making sure the cabin sees you as the lone holdout." Avery leaned back slightly, her hands resting on the armrests. "Lone doesn't mean wrong." The meal service concluded, and the lights dimmed slightly for the mid-flight stretch. Some passengers pulled out tablets or books, others reclined their seats and closed their eyes. But the hum in the cabin wasn't entirely relaxed. Avery could feel the undercurrent, the way attention still drifted toward her row. Clara struck again an hour later, this time with a different tactic. She approached Avery with a polite, almost sympathetic expression. "Ms. Sinclair, I'd like to make a suggestion that might help ease the tension in the cabin. There's a private crew rest seat available. Just behind the cockpit, more space, more privacy. It might be more comfortable for you." Avery's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Thank you for the offer, but I'm fine here." Clara's tone stayed pleasant, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of frustration. "Are you sure it's a quiet space, away from all this attention? Attention you've created," Avery thought. Out loud, she simply said, "Yes, I'm sure." Clara's voice softened, almost a whisper now. Sometimes it's better to take the higher road. Avery's reply was calm but carried weight. The higher road isn't always the quietest one. There was the briefest pause before Clara stepped back, her smile fixed but brittle. She moved down the aisle without another word, but Avery knew the conversation wasn't over. It had simply shifted into a deeper stalemate. Miles spoke without looking up from his tablet. "You just told her no in a way she can't spin as unreasonable." "That was the point," Avery said. For the next half hour, Clara kept her distance, focusing on the other passengers. But Avery could feel the glances, the subtle shaping of perception. It was a battle being fought in whispers and half smiles. Then, as if on cue, one of the passengers from row 2, a middle-aged man in a navy blazer, stood and walked toward Avery's seat. He stopped beside her, leaning slightly into the aisle. "Ma'am, I don't know what's going on, but maybe if you just moved, we could all have a calmer flight." The statement was wrapped in the language of concern, but the implication was clear: you're the disruption. Avery looked up at him evenly. "I appreciate your perspective, but I'm sitting in the seat I was assigned. The captain has confirmed it's mine." The man shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just saying, sometimes it's not worth the fight." Avery's voice stayed soft, almost conversational. "And sometimes it is." The man hesitated, then gave a small shrug and returned to his seat. Miles caught Avery's eye and gave a subtle nod of approval. "You handled that perfectly," he said quietly. "It's not about winning the argument," she murmured. "It's about not letting someone else write the story while you're still in it." The rest of the cabin settled again, but the divide had been drawn more clearly. There were those watching with curiosity, those leaning toward Clara's framing, and those like Miles, who had begun to see through it. Avery knew the flight still had hours to go, and if Clara couldn't push her out with authority, she might try something riskier, something that would force the issue. The thought didn't make her nervous, it made her ready. The cabin lighting had shifted into the soft, warm glow meant to lull passengers into mid-flight drowsiness. The hum of the engines was steady, almost soothing. But Avery kept her senses sharp. She'd been in enough high-stakes rooms, boardrooms, courtrooms, even congressional hearings to know that the most dangerous moves often came in the quiet moments. Clara had been conspicuously absent from first class for nearly an hour, which in itself was unusual. The other flight attendants moved through with routine efficiency, avoiding eye contact with Avery. Even Lena Price, who had shown small signs of empathy earlier, seemed to be keeping her head down. Across the aisle, Miles Carter had gone from casually observant to quietly tense. He leaned slightly toward Avery without drawing attention. "She's planning something. I can feel it." Avery gave the faintest nod. She was thinking the same thing. It happened just as the beverage cart was being stowed. Clara reappeared, walking quickly from the economy section toward the front. Her expression was composed, but there was a tautness to her movements. She stopped near the galley and spoke into the intercom phone, her voice too low for most to hear, but Avery caught a few words: security, non-compliant passenger, potential risk. She wasn't talking about a theoretical situation. She was talking about Avery. The words landed like a stone in Avery's chest, not from fear, but from the sheer brazenness of it. Clara was fabricating a safety threat, the one accusation that could override the captain's earlier decision and justify removal. Miles had heard enough to understand. "She's lying," he whispered, disbelief in his tone. Avery's eyes stayed on Clara. This wasn't just an attempt to humiliate her. This was a calculated maneuver to put her on the defensive, to force her into reacting in a way that could be spun as aggression. Within minutes, Lena approached Avery's seat, her face pale. "Ms. Sinclair, the purser would like you to move to a crew rest seat for safety reasons." Avery's voice was steady. "And what safety reason would that be?" Lena hesitated. I wasn't told specifics." "That's because there aren't any." Miles cut in. "This is harassment, and it's on video." A few nearby passengers perked up at that, their attention sharpening. A man in row 3 muttered, "That's not right." Avery shifted her gaze back to Lena. "Please inform the captain that I will not be moving unless there is a legitimate, documented safety issue." Lena swallowed hard. I'll let him know." She retreated toward the cockpit, glancing nervously at Clara on her way. Clara's voice floated down the aisle, pitched just loud enough for passengers to hear. "We're doing everything we can to ensure everyone's safety and comfort. Thank you for your patience." The phrasing was deliberate, crafted to imply that Avery was the obstacle to both. The cockpit door opened. Captain Daniel Rourke stepped out, his eyes scanning the cabin until they locked on Avery. He approached, his expression controlled but serious. "Ms. Sinclair, may I speak with you?" "Of course." "Captain." He crouched slightly to speak at her level, keeping his voice low. "The purser has raised a safety concern regarding your presence in this seat. She has not provided me with evidence to substantiate it." "Because there is none," Avery replied calmly. "I've been seated here without incident." Rourke nodded once. "That was my understanding as well. I will handle this." He straightened, turning to face Clara, who stood a few rows back. "Clara, please join me in the galley, now." The command was crisp, and for the first time since boarding, Clara's composure wavered. She followed him forward, the two disappearing behind the curtain. The cabin was quiet except for the drone of the engines. Miles leaned toward Avery. If he sides with her, this could still go south. Avery's gaze stayed on the curtain. "If he does, then we'll make sure it doesn't stay quiet." A few minutes later, the curtain rustled and Rourke stepped back into view, his expression darker than before. Clara emerged behind him, her posture stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line. The captain addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to assure you that there is no safety risk on this flight. All passengers are in their assigned seats and are in compliance with our procedures. We will continue to our destination without further delay." There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, shoulders relaxing, murmurs of approval. It was clear to everyone that the issue had been resolved in Avery's favor, though no one missed the undercurrent of tension that remained between her and Clara. Rourke turned to Avery. "You have my apologies for the disruption." "Thank you, Captain," Avery said. He gave a curt nod and returned to the cockpit. Clara lingered for a heartbeat longer, her eyes meeting Avery's with something unreadable anger, maybe, or the calculation of someone figuring out their next move. Then she disappeared into the galley. Miles let out a quiet breath. That was close. Closer than it should have been, Avery said, but the truth has a way of catching up. The cabin slowly returned to its rhythm, but Avery knew the matter wasn't over. Clara might have been checked in public, but her type didn't take losses quietly. She'd find another way to make her presence felt before the wheels touched the ground. Avery settled back into her seat, her mind moving ahead not just to the rest of the flight, but to what would happen afterward. Incidents like this didn't just fade into memory. They had ripple effects, and she intended to make sure those ripples reached farther than Clara Whitfield could ever anticipate. For the next half hour, Clara kept her distance. It was as if she had retreated entirely, But Avery knew better. People like Clara didn't stop. They adapted. When the direct route failed, they found back doors. And sometimes, those could be harder to spot. The first signs were small. Avery's request for water took twice as long to be fulfilled as it did for the passengers around her. When the hot towels came out, her row was somehow skipped until Miles quietly flagged another attendant. The dessert cart rolled through, offering cheesecake and chocolate mousse to every passenger except Avery. Lena caught the oversight and quickly corrected it, but the look she gave Avery said she knew it wasn't an accident. Miles noticed, too. "This is the long game," he murmured. "Make you uncomfortable enough that you leave on your own." "It won't work," Avery said softly, keeping her voice steady. "She's hoping I'll either snap or disappear. I'll do neither." But Clara wasn't just targeting comfort. She was shaping perception. Avery caught her leaning in close to a passenger in row 3, speaking in a voice pitched just low enough to sound private, but not so low that nearby ears couldn't catch words like disruptive and unusual behavior. Each time Clara walked away, the passenger's eyes would flick toward Avery, their expression a little tighter, a little more uncertain. Avery didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, not to record video, which airline policy prohibited mid-flight, but to quietly type notes, times, actions, who was present, a detailed record. She had built entire corporate investigations on less. Miles glanced at her screen. "Planning to take this further, much further," she replied. Clara's next move was more pointed. She approached Avery's seat with a calm, almost friendly expression. "Ms. Sinclair, I just wanted to let you know that we've had multiple passenger concerns about your demeanor. No one wants discomfort on such a long flight." Avery met her gaze evenly. "Have any of these passengers spoken to me directly?" Clara's smile didn't falter. "Of course not. It's not their place to confront you. That's my role. Then I'd appreciate specifics," Avery said. "What behaviors have they found concerning Clara's eyes narrowed? Just slightly. It's more about the overall atmosphere. People feel uneasy." Avery let the pause stretch, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. "That's interesting, because the only actions I've taken on this flight are sitting quietly in my assigned seat and responding when spoken to. If that causes unease, perhaps the problem isn't with me." Clara's smile flattened into something tighter. "I'm just trying to ensure a smooth experience for all passengers. Then perhaps start by ensuring you're telling them the truth," Avery replied. There was a flicker in Clara's eyes, anger. Maybe even the realization that Avery wasn't going to play the part of the quietly compliant passenger she was used to dealing with. Without another word, Clara turned and walked briskly toward the galley. Miles shook his head. "That was a solid hit." "It's not about winning hits," Avery said. "It's about making sure she knows I'm documenting every move she makes." The next hour passed in an uneasy rhythm. Clara's manipulations grew more subtle delays in service, faintly audible comments to colleagues that Avery suspected were designed to be overheard, small inconveniences that were easy to dismiss individually but obvious in pattern. Lena was the only member of the crew who seemed caught in the middle. At one point, she stopped by Avery's seat with a refill of water and murmured so quietly it was almost lost under the engine noise. "I'm sorry about all this." Avery looked at her, searching her expression. "You know this isn't right." "I do," Lena admitted, "but it's complicated." "It always is," Avery said gently. "That doesn't make it any less wrong." When Lena walked away, Avery felt a shift not in Clara's behavior, but in her own resolve. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was thinking about what would happen after they landed, about the conversation she would have with Aerolux's board, about the systems that allowed people like Clara to thrive unchecked. She began to plan. She thought about the emails she could send within an hour of touchdown, the calls she could place to journalists who'd covered systemic bias in the airline industry. She pictured the headlines factual, measured, but unmistakable in their weight. And she thought about the quiet, factual way she could deliver her experience to Aerolux's internal ethics team, ensuring that it wouldn't just be filed away, but escalated. The more Clara tried to push her out, the more Avery felt the quiet strength of knowing she could outlast her, not just here in the cabin, but in the spaces that mattered most. As the lights dimmed for the evening segment of the flight, Avery glanced toward the cockpit. She didn't need to speak to Captain Rourke again, not yet. But she could feel his awareness, the way he kept an eye on the balance in his cabin. He hadn't interfered since the last confrontation, but she suspected he knew this was far from over. Miles leaned over once more, his tone curious. "You ever think about just ending it here? Just getting off the flight drama-free and moving on?" Avery's reply was simple. "If I walk away now, nothing changes, and the next person in this seat might not have the same choice." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're not just playing defense." "No," she said softly. "I'm building the next move." In the darkness, with only the low hum of the engines around them, Avery felt the tension coiling tighter. Clara's small acts of sabotage might not break her, but they could set the stage for something larger. And Avery was ready. The cabin was dark, except for the soft glow of reading lights and the muted flicker from seatback screens. Most passengers had slipped into the half-sleep of a long-haul flight, their faces slack, headphones resting crookedly against their heads. But Avery was wide awake. She sat still, her posture relaxed enough to avoid drawing attention, but her mind was moving like a chess player plotting 10 moves ahead. Clara's persistence had confirmed one thing: this wasn't going to stop until the plane touched down. And even then, without a record, it could vanish into thin air. Avery reached for her phone again, keeping it low in her lap. She opened an encrypted messaging app, one she used for sensitive corporate communications. Her thumbs moved with practiced ease. To Jordan Vega, Aerolux Airways. Board member message mid-flight, ALX 482. Purser attempting removal without cause. Captain aware. Will brief on landing. Prepare for media escalation. Will forward timestamp notes. She hesitated for half a second, then added, "This is not isolated. Check previous incident logs under Whitfield." She hit send, somewhere on the ground. Jordan Vega, a man with both the authority and the appetite for systemic change, would be receiving her message. Miles glanced over. Calling in reinforcements. Just giving someone a head start. She murmured. At the front of the cabin, Clara emerged from the galley. Even in the dim light, her presence was sharp. She moved with the calm assurance of someone who believed they were still in control. Avery knew that meant one thing. Clara thought she still had an angle to play. The purser stopped at row 2, leaning down to speak to the passenger seated there. Avery couldn't hear the words, but she caught the way the woman's gaze slid toward her afterward, assessing, maybe even wary. Clara had been seeding her narrative for hours, and even subtle suggestions could take root in a confined space like this. Miles whispered, "She's still building her case." "Let her," Avery replied softly. "She doesn't realize the trial's already moved to a different court." When Clara finally approached Avery's seat, her tone was honeyed, almost falsely warm. "Ms. Sinclair, I wanted to check in one last time. We're still concerned about passenger comfort, and I'd like to offer you the chance to relocate before we begin our descent later." Avery looked up at her, her voice calm but edged with steel. "My comfort is fine, Miss Whitfield. And I think we both know the real concern here isn't about seating." Clara's smile thinned. "I'm only doing my job." "Then you might want to consider what your job will be after this flight," Avery said evenly. For the briefest second, Clara's expression faltered. Then she smoothed it over with that same professional mask and moved away. But Avery had seen the crack. The next hour passed in a quiet, tense stalemate. Avery reviewed her notes, double-checking every timestamp, every small incident. She added brief observations about passengers who had interacted with Clara in ways that seemed influenced by her narrative. It wasn't just about proving her own treatment. It was about documenting a pattern. Midway through, Lena stopped by again, this time under the pretense of offering tea. She set the cup on Avery's tray table and murmured so softly it barely reached her ears. "I think she's going to try again right before landing." Avery's eyes flicked up. "Why?" "If she can make it look like you're refusing to comply with a last-minute crew instruction." "It's easier to justify reporting you as a problem passenger," Lena whispered. Avery gave a slow nod. "Thank you for telling me." Lena straightened and walked away, her face carefully neutral. Avery knew that small act carried risk for her. An idea began to form, one that could shut this down in a way Clara couldn't spin. She tapped another message into her phone, this time to Jordan Vega again. "Message need direct patch to ops control before landing. Captain must be looped. Will request in-flight call." A few minutes later, her phone buzzed with a secure reply. "Cleared. Ask Captain to open line on company channel. Legal and PR standing by." Avery waited until the beverage cart had passed, then rose slowly and walked to the front, catching Captain Rourke's attention as he stepped out of the cockpit to stretch. "Captain, I need to request a direct call to Aerolux Operations Control. Board member authorization. It's regarding the ongoing situation in your cabin." Rourke's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're moving this above my level. I'm moving it to the level where it belongs," Avery said quietly. He studied her for a moment, then gave a single nod. "I'll make the call." Avery returned to her seat. Across the aisle, Miles raised an eyebrow. "What's happening?" She smiled faintly. The ground's about to shift under her feet. 20 minutes later, Rourke came down the aisle and crouched beside her seat again. "Ms. Sinclair, operations is on the line. They've requested you join the conversation in the galley." As Avery stood, she caught the way Clara stiffened near the service area. The purser's eyes followed her, suspicion flickering there, but she said nothing. "In the galley." Rourke handed Avery the receiver. The voice on the other end was crisp, controlled. "Ms. Sinclair, this is Dana Myers, Director of Flight Operations. We've been briefed. You are to remain in your assigned seat for the remainder of the flight. If there are further issues, inform the captain immediately. Post-landing, we will be conducting a formal review." "Thank you," Avery replied. "I'll provide my documentation on arrival." When she handed the receiver back, Rourke gave her a small nod before returning to the cockpit. Clara was still there, but now she looked less certain, her professional mask feeling thinner by the second. Avery returned to 1A and settled in. Miles leaned over. "That looked official." "It was," Avery said quietly. "Now we wait for the landing, and then the real work begins." Outside the window, the night sky stretched endlessly, the lights of distant cities flickering far below. Avery let herself breathe, knowing that Clara had run out of in-flight moves. But on the ground, the board, the press, and the public were about to become part of the cabin conversation Clara had tried to control. The low chime of the seatbelt sign came on, followed by Captain Rourke's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into New York. Cabin crew, please prepare for landing." The change in atmosphere was instant. Passengers adjusted their seats, tucked away blankets, and slipped on jackets. The quiet hum of cruise flight was replaced by the rustle of movement, the low chatter of anticipation. But in first class, beneath the ordinary rhythm, Avery could feel something else. Clara wasn't done. She saw it in the way the purser moved brisk, controlled, her eyes flicking often toward 1A. Avery had been in enough negotiations to recognize the look of someone making a last attempt before the door closed. Miles leaned slightly across the aisle. "She's going to try something before we hit the ground." Avery gave the faintest nod. She was expecting it. Clara had one final opportunity to rewrite the ending of this flight, and Avery knew she wouldn't waste it. As the crew began their final checks, Clara approached Avery's row. Her voice was calm but pitched to carry just enough for nearby passengers to overhear. "Ms. Sinclair, we need you to store all personal items now and secure your seat for landing. That includes powering off all devices immediately." "Of course," Avery said, powering down her phone and placing it in the seat pocket. Clara didn't move away. "There's also been a request from the captain that you refrain from speaking with other passengers for the remainder of the flight." Avery's eyes met hers. "And what exactly is the safety justification for that?" Clara's smile was tight. "It's about avoiding distractions during critical phases of flight." Several passengers glanced up, and their curiosity piqued. Miles frowned openly. "That's not a standard instruction." Avery kept her tone even. "I'll comply with any instruction that has a legitimate safety basis. Otherwise, I'll continue sitting here quietly, as I have for the last several hours." Clara's gaze hardened. "Very well." She stepped away, but Avery could feel the heat of her frustration even as she turned toward the galley. The descent continued, the city lights beginning to glitter beneath them. The seatbelt sign stayed on, and the cabin settled into the final approach routine. But Avery's attention remained forward, waiting for the next move. It came with 15 minutes to landing. Clara reappeared, this time with a notepad in hand. "Ms. Sinclair, I need to confirm some information for the flight report." She clicked her pen. "Full name, home address, and contact number." Avery tilted her head slightly. "And what is the stated reason for collecting that information mid-flight?" "It's standard procedure for any passenger incident that may require follow-up," Clara replied smoothly. Avery didn't move. "I'll be happy to provide that information directly to Aerolux's legal department on the ground." Clara's smile was pure formality. "Very well," she said again, but the stiffness in her voice gave her away. This wasn't how she'd planned it to go. When Clara walked away, Miles leaned in. "She's building her report right now." "Let her," Avery said. "Every word she writes will be weighed against the record I've already set in motion." As the plane dipped lower, the cabin crew moved through one last time to ensure everything was secure. Lena stopped briefly at Avery's seat, pretending to adjust the overhead bin. "Just so you know, the captain's already spoken to Ops. They're meeting the plane." "Thank you," Avery said quietly. The wheels touched down with a firm thud, the reverse thrusters roaring before the engines eased back into their idle hum. A ripple of relief moved through the passengers, another journey complete. But for Avery, the real arrival was just beginning. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Claire made one final announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that all passengers remain seated until the seatbelt sign is switched off. We have a quick matter to address before deplaning. The implication was obvious an official matter. Here in first class, a few passengers cast quick looks toward Avery. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and immediately two figures appeared at the front of the cabin, one in a dark Aerolux uniform with a silver badge, the other wearing the subtle earpiece of airport security. Behind them, Captain Rourke stepped out of the cockpit. Clara straightened, her voice smooth. This is the passenger in question. The uniformed woman didn't look at Clara. Instead, she addressed Avery directly. Ms. Sinclair, I'm Dana Myers, Director of Flight Operations. We've spoken on the phone. Yes, Avery said. Thank you for meeting the flight. Dana turned slightly toward Clara. Purser Whitfield, I'll be speaking with you privately in just a moment. For now, please step aside. The slight pause in the cabin was palpable. Clara's face froze, but she complied, moving stiffly to the galley. Dana focused back on Avery. We've reviewed your preliminary notes. We'll complete a formal interview landside. But for now, you're clear to disembark at your convenience. Thank you, Avery said, her voice carrying just enough for the nearest passengers to hear. I appreciate Aerolux taking this seriously. As she gathered her bag, Miles caught her eye. You just flipped the ending. No, Avery replied quietly. I just made sure the ending was honest. The aisle began to move, passengers filing out. Some gave Avery small nods or looks of solidarity as they passed. She stepped forward when her turn came, feeling the shift in the air in acknowledgement, quiet but real, that the story Clara had tried to write had been overwritten. But Avery knew this wasn't the end. It was simply the moment before the real conversation began, one that wouldn't be confined to the cabin walls. And as she stepped into the jet bridge, she was ready for it. The jet bridge was cool and still, the air carrying the faint tang of fuel and disinfectant. Avery stepped into it with calm, deliberate strides, her carry-on rolling silently behind her. She felt the space expand ahead, no longer confined to a single seat in 1A, no longer boxed in by Clara's narrative. Just beyond the bridge, in the private arrivals lounge Aerolux reserved for first-class passengers, Dana Myers waited with two other people. Jordan Vega, tall and steady, his tailored suit immaculate despite the late hour, and a woman Avery recognized as Amelia North, Aerolux's chief ethics officer. The presence of both told her this was bigger than Clara realized. Dana motioned toward a small conference room off to the side. Ms. Sinclair, thank you for agreeing to speak with us before leaving the terminal. Avery stepped inside. The door closed softly behind her, muting the noise of disembarking passengers. She placed her bag neatly at her feet and sat, her posture open but purposeful. Amelia started first. We've reviewed your preliminary account and the captain's statement. Before we proceed, is there anything you want to add that's not in your written notes? Yes, Avery said. What happened tonight wasn't about a seating dispute. It was about a pattern of behavior designed to intimidate, discredit, and remove a passenger based on assumptions that had nothing to do with safety. It was calculated, and it relied on the hope that I wouldn't have the means to push back. Jordan leaned forward slightly. And you did push back. I did, Avery said. But that's not enough. I want Aerolux to address the structure that allowed this to happen. One person's removal doesn't solve the problem if the system rewards the same behavior in someone else next month. Dana exchanged a glance with Amelia. Purser Whitfield has been removed from active duty pending investigation. That decision was made before we landed, based on multiple reports from passengers and crew. Avery's expression didn't change, but she felt the weight of the moment. She wasn't here for vindication. She was here for change. And yet, it mattered that the first step had been taken before the engines even cooled. Jordan spoke again. "What would you like to see happen beyond this investigation transparency?" Avery said without hesitation. "Public acknowledgement when misconduct is confirmed. Mandatory bias and accountability training for all in-flight leaders. A confidential reporting channel for passengers that doesn't rely on crew discretion. And a clear process for review when a removal is requested, so that no one is pulled from a seat without legitimate cause." Her voice was steady, but the undertone was personal. Tonight, it was me in 1A. Tomorrow, it could be someone without my platform, without my resources. That's why this can't just be handled quietly. Amelia nodded slowly. "Those are significant changes." "They're necessary," Avery replied. "Aerolux can either lead on this issue or wait until public pressure forces the same outcome." Jordan sat back, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. "You came prepared for this conversation." "Always," Avery said. There was a pause, and then Dana closed her notebook. "We'll convene with the board in 48 hours. I'd like you to join that meeting via secure link." "I will," Avery said. When she finally stepped out into the terminal, the concourse was nearly empty. The late-night quiet broken only by the distant whir of floor polishers and the muffled calls of closing announcements. Miles was waiting near the exit, leaning against a column with his camera bag slung over one shoulder. "You good?" he asked. "Better than good," Avery said. "We've got the start of something." Miles studied her for a moment. "You know, most people would have just taken the apology and the voucher and moved on. And most people would have been right back in the same position a month later." Avery said, "That's why I'm not letting this go." He nodded, the faintest look of admiration in his eyes. "Guess I'll be seeing this in the news." "You might," she said with a small smile. Outside, the city's night air wrapped around her, cool and alive. A car waited at the curb, Jordan's doing, no doubt. As she slid into the back seat, she felt the shift deep inside her, that subtle click when something private becomes public, when a single confrontation becomes a catalyst. 2 days later, the Aerolux press release went live. It confirmed the suspension of Purser Whitfield, the initiation of a full review into in-flight passenger removal protocols, and the creation of an independent oversight panel. The language was formal, careful, but the message was clear. And beneath the press release, in smaller type, was an acknowledgement Avery hadn't expected. "We thank Ms. Avery Sinclair for bringing this matter to our attention with professionalism and clarity." The story spread industry publications, travel blogs, social media feeds. It was dissected, debated, and in some corners, it sparked uncomfortable conversations. Not everyone agreed with her stance. Not everyone wanted to believe bias could survive in the polished luxury of first class. But enough people listened. Enough people saw themselves in 1A. Weeks later, Avery boarded another Aerolux flight, this time with a quiet sense of symmetry. She was greeted by name, her seat waiting without question, her presence acknowledged without tension. The crew moved with the same efficiency she'd always appreciated. But now she saw something else, more deliberate eye contact, more measured words, a visible awareness of fairness. As the plane leveled at cruising altitude, Avery looked out over the curve of the horizon. This wasn't just about winning a seat. It was about securing the right for anyone, in any seat, to travel without the weight of someone else's prejudice pressing against them. She thought of that night on ALX 482, the low hum of the engines, the steady beat of her own pulse as she decided not to yield. She thought of Lena's quiet courage, of Miles' steady witness, of Captain Rourke's willingness to keep the situation from escalating. And she thought of Clara Whitfield, now a name in a file somewhere, a reminder of the cost of choosing control over integrity. Avery smiled faintly, not out of triumph, but out of certainty. Change didn't happen in a single flight or a single board meeting. It happened in persistence, in the refusal to accept that things had to stay the same. Somewhere in the cabin behind her, a passenger laughed softly. Glasses clinked. The world kept moving forward, one flight at a time. Some stories end when the plane lands. This one didn't, because what happened to Avery Sinclair wasn't just about one seat. It was about a system that still allows bias to hide behind procedure, and the courage it takes to confront it without raising your voice but raising the standard for everyone. It's easy to forget that behind every headline is a person, a mother, a father, a friend, someone just trying to get home. And it's just as easy to let small injustices slide, telling ourselves they're not worth the fight. But change never comes from silence. It comes from moments like this where dignity holds its ground, and truth takes the seat it was promised. We tell these stories not just to expose what's wrong, but to remind ourselves of what's worth protecting: respect, fairness, and the belief that every passenger matters equally. If this story moved you, if it made you think, made you feel, made you remember why justice matters, even at 35,000 feet, then help us keep telling them. Like this video, share it, subscribe to the channel, because somewhere, on some future flight, someone will be glad you did.